Okay, yeah, let's get going. Okay, hello everybody. This is the Canadian Comics Publishing Panel, and I'm thrilled to be here today. And we have some incredible panelists representing a true cross-section of Canadian comics publishing. It's a real honor to have all these people here and have a discussion. Just to let everyone know, this panel is being recorded and will appear on the YouTube channel later. So if you do not want your face or audio, then please mute yourself and turn your video off, and that's fine. You can still listen. I want to acknowledge that I run Conundrum Press, and I'm based in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, which is in Mi'kma'ki, and the ancestral home of the Mi'kmaq people who've lived here for time immemorial and continue to live and thrive here. So all of you, of course, live in all different places. And if you want to type in your land acknowledgement, feel free to do so in the chat. There's a chat option for Zoom. Many of us probably have figured that out a long time ago with the pandemic going on. I will introduce everybody, but I'm not going to just sit and read their bios. I hate doing that, and people don't like listening to that. So I will say that the bios for all our panelists are on the website of the symposium. And so please check those out. However, I will start with an introduction in a second of each person. Will introduce themselves and just talk a couple minutes, couple sentences, couple minutes, just like what their background is. Obviously, many people here have many connections to Canadian comics, and we can't cover everything, and we want to have everybody have a chance to talk and give their point of view. And after, type questions in the chat. There's a chat function on Zoom. Someone, probably not me, will be looking at that and feeding us some questions. So if you have a question for any of the panelists, feel free to ask it. Hopefully we'll be getting to that, and then there will be more of a Q&A. The last 15 minutes will pretty much be devoted to that, answering those questions if we haven't gotten to them over the course of this is what, an hour and a half panel. So there's lots to talk about. So why don't we get started with some introductions of who's here. I mentioned my name's Andy Brown. I'm the moderator of this panel, and I run Conundrum Press. I have been, this is my 26th year. So I've been doing it for 25 years. I started in Montreal in 1995 and had the last 10 or 12 years been in Nova Scotia. And I publish literary graphic novels exclusively from Canadians and get them distributed all over the world, in the States and internationally. So we're going to go in the order that we have on the schedule here. So Julia, would you like to introduce yourself? Julia Pohl-Miranda, Drawn and Quarterly.
Hi, my name is Julia Pohl-Miranda. I am the marketing director at Drawn and Quarterly, and I have been part of Drawn and Quarterly's team since the year 2008, when I started as an intern. And I am involved with, all of the elements of marketing our books, as well as, since we are a small team, I get to be involved in a lot of different ways on a lot of different projects. And what else is there to say about me? I'm also involved in our bookstores, running and promoting and managing our bookstores.
Okay, thanks very much, Julia. Next, we would have Negan Sinclair from Highwater Press, among other things, I believe.
So bonjour, everybody. My name is Negan Sinclair, and I'm not a publisher, but I do head up a very small section of a publication company called the Debway series with Highwater Press, also known as Portage and Main Press. And we have become one of the largest publishers of Indigenous literatures in North America. And in a very short period of time, in about the very first book of my series, and one of their very first books was my collection on Indigenous writings in Manitoba, edited with Warren Carreau, and that then set the platform for an Indigenous author series that works with Indigenous editors. And so there's not a plethora of Indigenous editors I am the incoming president of the Indigenous Editors Association of Canada, so I can tell you there's not many of us who do have the competency of editing, but we do edit predominantly graphic novels in our series. And so what I do is I mentor young editors, young Indigenous writers who seek to become editors, to work with other young Indigenous writers to create what we have created, which is some of the largest output of Indigenous comics across North America in a very short period of time. And some of those have gone on to, been nominated for Eisner Awards. And then, of course, the recent best-selling book, which continues to be a best-selling book here in Canada, which is called This Place, 150 Years Retold. I'll talk a little bit about that book when it comes to my turn. And it's just a really honor to be here with all of these very wonderful comics people, and particularly those who theorize around comics, because I'm also a professor at the University of Manitoba, so I teach courses on Indigenous graphic novels in the Department of Native Studies, occasionally the Department of English, depending on who's heading up that year and if they approve my cross-referencing, as you know. So as you know, those are bureaucratic things. And so just an honor to be here. I also posted something in the chat just so that you can think a little bit about the context of when you make a territorial acknowledgement. There are, right-wing forces, governments across the country who are continuing to resist and refuse to recognize the relationships in which we share, complicated and often very violent that they are. In Indigenous territories across the country. So, I'm very happy to be here on Treaty 1 territory, where we are not perfect by any means, but we're certainly in a learning journey together, walking together, moving together with Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, Lakota, Dakota peoples, as well as the home, of course, we're within the nation of the Métis Nation. So it's a pleasure to be here. There's my cat, Nibby, and she'll definitely take over my presentation. So
no, that's okay.
And a huge thanks to Canada for all the great work that they do at the University of Winnipeg, and including me in here. And if you get a chance to check out the One Book You Winnipeg project that the Department of English did, it's just a remarkable work that they did over there with the book that I just referenced, This Place. So anyways, thanks everybody. Miigwech.
Okay, thank you, Niigaan. That's great. And next on our panel is Luc Bossé at Pow Pow Press in Montreal.
Hi, hello everybody. I'm Luc Bossé. Really glad to be here with you today. To present a bit of myself, I've been working in advertisement for the first 10 years of the 2000 years. After a while, I got fed up with that, and I started to work on my own comics and had a blog when it was the fashion to do blogs. Is it still in? I don't know. So in 2010, I founded the Pow Pow, Edition Pow Pow. Been working with mainly Canadian authors. Most of them are from Quebec, of course, because we publish mainly in French. 5 years ago, we started to translate some of our books because I like so much TCAF. I want to be part of all that culture, and I want to join in. We also started to distribute our books in France about at the same time. A lot going on for a small team, struggling to learn the métier, the work, the job of being a publisher. And I guess I'm still learning English too. So
that's all right.
Hello everybody. It's going to be a great afternoon.
Yes, thank you so much. Next would be Frédéric Gauthier at La Pastèque, also Montreal.
Yes, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. So I'm a co-founder of La Pastèque. It's our 23rd anniversary this year. We have been publishing graphic novels for adults for 23 years now, and we've been distributed in France, Belgium, Switzerland, all the Franco-European countries since the beginning. And then we also grew our catalog to children picture books for the past 15 years or so, and do also kids comics and YA comics. And the company is growing we just created a production company for the past 2 years doing animation series. for the web and television, and doing a lot of audio projects also. So expanding our comics expertise, and we're working mostly with Quebec or Canadian authors and some European creators as well. So thank you, and have a great discussion.
Okay, thanks, Fred. And next is Sarah Sawler from EMANATA.
Hi, everyone. So I am from EMANATA. I'm also from Conundrum Press. Yeah, so I handle a Conundrum. I handle the marketing, which involves dealing with sales and distribution and the website and really anything that could be possibly tied in with marketing, as we're a super small team. That includes organizing launches and whatnot. For EMANATA is a new YA imprint. And we're just going to be publishing one book a year to start, but the focus is on underrepresented voices, writing young adult fiction or nonfiction stories. My focus is really on character-driven stories, so whether those are memoirs or fiction, it doesn't matter. But I really want stories that we haven't already heard a lot of yet. And so that's what my focus is on. The other thing is that I also have a focus on folks living in Canada. So currently I'm focused on accepting submissions from those creators. If there's teams, because lots of people work in teams now, so they're working cross internationally. I'm also accepting as long as 50% of the team is Canadian. So that's the focus of EMANATA currently. So thanks, Canada, for having us.
Thanks, Sarah. And next on the list is James Waley in Hamilton.
Yes, I'm James Waley. I was the 2015 inductee into the Canadian Comic Book Creator Hall of Fame. Back in the 70s, I was the publisher, editor-in-chief, art director, as well as a featured writer, artist, and colorist in Orb magazine, which was an anthology we were publishing back then. I was also at that time the creator of the Canadian superhero, The Northern Light, which John Bell mentioned in his book, Invaders from the North, was the first serious national superhero to emerge since the Golden Age. This is like a year before Captain Canuck. I also have freelanced over the years, writing for Heavy Metal magazine, Charlton Comics. I was the art director and a writer on Tales from the Bay, which was published for the Hudson's Bay Company for their 325th anniversary. I was a manager for a comic shop, Dragon Lady Comics. I put on their comic conventions, and I went on to do my own comic conventions, Super Show comic conventions in Toronto and different places in Ontario, London, and Windsor. I was also the instigator and first director of the Joe Shuster Awards. And right now I'm currently writing, art directing, and strategizing a relaunch for the Northern Light character. I'm also working on a prose book on Captain George Henderson of Memory Lane in Toronto, who was one of the really primary figures in Canadian comic fandom, and had probably one of the first comic shops in all of North America. I'm also helping Ivan with a Trailblazers anthology that's coming out this year for the 80th anniversary, sort of as a consulting editor, and I've done written a couple pages. I co-curated a gallery showing at the Propeller Gallery years ago, which was called Pop at Propeller, spelled PPOP, and that's panels, paintings, and other pursuits. And it was about comic creators and other stuff that they do beyond just creating comics. So they may be painters, or they may be filmmakers, or they may be musicians. So we highlighted a lot of that stuff about them. So that's about that. Trying to keep busy in my golden years.
Keeping busy, indeed. Yes. Well, thanks everybody. Yeah. As we can hear, everybody's staying very busy. And I think people will have noticed there's a huge, as I mentioned earlier, there's a large cross section of Canadian comics here. So everyone sort of has their, a specialty, but we're all involved in the same, what Pierre Bourdieu called the cultural field. So I am going to try to pull all these pieces together by talking about Canadian comics publishing as a cultural field, and everyone on this panel has is within that field, but also has their own specialties or their own knowledgeable in other areas. For example, YA was mentioned, of course, Quebec is mentioned, Indigenous publishing has been mentioned. So hopefully that is how we're going to spin this whole conversation, and also the past, the present, and the future of Canadian comics, which will be a very interesting discussion. We're going to try not to talk about the pandemic at all this entire conversation and see how that goes. I'd love to hear about the past and the future, mostly, of Canadian comics. But all that being said, I mean, this panel is called Canadian Comics Publishing, and I've just made the statement that we're all part of the Canadian comics publishing field. That might not be true. Some of us on this panel might not actually consider ourselves within the Canadian comics publishing field. I would specifically be referring here to publishers in Quebec and obviously Indigenous publishers. So I'm going to start there. I'm not going to get into the comics field because I'm assuming everyone here is in the comics field, and that's a huge rabbit hole that we're not going to go down. But there's probably a discussion I can just start out here about being Canadian and what it means to be in the Canadian comics field. And I'm going to start with Niigaan because I suspect, unless you don't want to, we can either start with you or we can start with the Quebec contingent. And you can start, I mean, that book, 150 Years, This Place, 150 Years Retold, you were involved in that. But were you involved as a writer? That Highwater published that book, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's funny. Well, it's very Canadian, I suppose, to start with the two individuals perhaps that represent industries that are seeking to be not involved or somehow different or autonomous to the Canadian industry, but that's that's fine. That's fine. I'm happy to do it. I was more shocked as like very infrequently do I get introduced as let's talk about Canadian anything and then let's talk to Niigaan, because I'm often the person that's going I am the outside of Canada. So
well, that's the opinion that I guess I'm asking about, because I think that's an important opinion, and I will ask Fred and Luc about the same thing.
Yeah, I just plugged in my microphone. Sorry if I switched my sound there. Okay, all right. So like basically what I do is I'm a facilitator, but I'm also a writer. I write comic books. But I've never really written a full-length comic book. I've written portions of comic books, and I've worked with Renegade Press out in Alberta. I've worked with Graphic Classics in the United States, and I've worked also with lots of other people who do sort of one-offs, like Michigan State University Press, writing my own story, working with Gregory Kmichik, GMB Kmichik, who illustrated my story, Trickster Reflections. So there's lots of different texts out there that I've written. But this particular story that we worked with Highwater Press, basically the story was that we retold Canada during the 150th anniversary of a country that was filled with maple syrupy sweetness, talking about Canadian nationalism and basically telling the same one-dimensional story I learned in my grade 6 textbook in Ashern, Manitoba, about pioneers and the amazingness of the Canadian state, even though they murdered women and children on the prairies here, and the amazingness of Sir Johnny MacDonald, even though he's a raving racist, and et cetera, et cetera. And so we retold Canada from Indigenous perspectives, and what we did is we invited 10 writers, many of whom who had never written either comic books or had done one or two, to retell a 10-page story. Ended up being more like 12 to 15-page stories. With working with often Indigenous illustrators. As I said, there's my cat right there. And so, and then we created this text right here. So I actually pulled it up here. So if you want to see this text, everybody can see. You can all see the text, right?
Yeah.
And the cover is right here. So if you haven't seen the cover, we were made into a CBC podcast. And so it's been that big of a bestseller. But this book here, it has, basically what we did is we divided it up into every 15 years. And we retold Canada from Indigenous perspectives. So Kate Vermette, very popular artist, Richard Van Camp, Jen Storm, Kateriak Wenzi Dam. And then, of course, I wrote a story in there about the Oka resistance in 1990. My years were between 1990 and 2005. We basically took 1867 as Confederation and then all the way up to 2017. And we basically retold those 150 years. And the last story by Chelsea Vowell is kind of a futuristic story. It's like a future reimagined. It basically is talking about what Canada would look like in the year 2350. And, reflecting back, it's basically a story about non-native people leave the earth due to environmental disaster. They leave Indigenous peoples on the earth. Indigenous peoples remake the economy, the ecology, and then non-Indigenous peoples are coming back. And Indigenous peoples are strategizing, what are we going to do now that non-Indigenous peoples are coming back from another planet? And so a really great story, and lots of different elements in here. My story is really kind of a documentation of a rather unknown part, or perhaps a reimagining of a very known part of Canadian history, which is the Oka resistance of 1990, which of course was influenced by Elijah Harper. Here's Gary Filmon, if you know the Manitoba premier at that time. There's Elijah Harper right there. And then it also talks about the events at Oka. And one of the most amazing things about this was I'm a character in the story. So it's a very autobiographical story. This is me right here, kind of being an apathetic youth who just frankly doesn't care about what's happening, and then grows to learn about activism in the 1970s and is taught by his mother by a trip to Oka, which didn't really happen, but it's a fictional retelling of my own experience growing up in the 1990s, and then, doing activism down at the Manitoba legislature and so on and so forth. And then there's another, there's sort of homages to different people throughout time. This is Richard Wagamese right here. Paul Martin. It ends off with the Kelowna Accord, which this fictionalized retelling of myself eventually goes to negotiate. I didn't participate in any of that. So it's sort of a fictional retelling based on real events. Similar to the movie, if you get a chance to see the new movie, there's a new movie on the Oka resistance. I've just blanked out there. But it's a really wonderful...
Beans.
What's that?
Beans? Isn't it called Beans?
Thank you, Beans, yes. And that it's a wonderful, wonderful independent film if you get a chance to see it. Anyways, so it's kind of like in a similar vein to that. So this particular graphic novel is kind of it's an instance to think about what I think Indigenous publishing is heading towards, which is a lot of things based within nonfiction retellings, basically experience. And an evidence of that is you can see this sort of plethora of memoir that's coming out right now around Indigenous peoples writing memoirs in their 20s and their 30s, which I think is just still kind of crazy. The idea that people are telling their life story when they're 24. But at the same time, it's evidence that the Canadian public is interested in Indigenous depictions, perspectives, ideas, experiences that perhaps we've never heard before. And so this is opening up from things like the TRC and the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And so what publishing is looking for at the moment is the experiences of Indigenous peoples, and then the kind of refocusing, the repositioning of what the Canadian state looks like, which is oftentimes extremely violent, very genocidal, and then opening up some really difficult truths with, like, for example, the unmarked graves at Kamloops and Cowessess and Brandon and so on. I think Canadians are generally miseducated or uneducated about their own country. And so what the publishing industry is responding to two elements. One is Indigenous peoples expressing their own sovereignty, which we always have. I'm a very fervent advocate that graphic novels are nothing new for Indigenous peoples. It, in fact, is the oldest publishing of the world and publishing here in North America. We've been drawing on birch bark and our own skins, in our own skins. We've been writing on rock faces. We've been doing graphic text for tens of thousands of years. We just only, graphic novels or comic books are only just the most recent incarnation of what has been the oldest historical literary tradition in the world. And of course, when I teach at the university, I don't start with graphic novels. I start with our traditional texts, which is our birch bark scrolls. And then I connect those to ways that we're thinking about graphic novels as of today. Like, for instance, Michael Uliganis, you read a Haida manga, he actually turns the book into a Haida door. You can tear out the pages and then make a Haida door out of it. Or David Robertson, who has done the Sugar Falls or the Seven Generations series, which I've done teacher's guides for. And what he's done there is he manipulates paneling. He works with the gutter space, remakes gutter spaces. There's no gutter spaces often that are empty. There are often birch bark trees in between those panels, which gets you to really think a lot about your positioning as a reader and how your relationship with the world outside of the book itself. And then, of course, David's also talking about intergenerational legacies of residential schools. And so, like, what does it look like for healing? What does it look like to tell your story? And particularly, what's your story? What's the story between men? You know, one of the biggest challenge, I think the biggest themes at the moment, challenges in our community is the issue of manhood and masculinity, healthy masculinity. Many of our uncles and our fathers have been very damaged and therefore have done very terrible things to our community, and particularly have been absent for most of us in our lives. And so these graphic novels, because oftentimes males are one of the main audiences, Indigenous manhood is often talked about the most in comic books. And so, you know, David Robertson's kind of made this his lifelong goal to talk about his own father, his own relationship with other men. And so that's one thing that I've also done a lot of in my work. And so I think Indigenous graphic novels is an extremely exciting area because it's the area that you're seeing the most amount of production for Indigenous literature. You know, poems and novels take so long to create. Comic books can be created in a few months, which is weird because there tends to be more hands, but yet people work together so collectively and quickly. But at there is more Indigenous comic books being produced than there is novels and poetry, which tells you that the industry of graphic novels, comics, is something that is burgeoning very quickly. And what we did, and I want to just do one more plug here before I get off my part. What am I doing here? I pulled up right here. We actually held at the University of Winnipeg with the University of Toronto Scarborough. We had the Indigenous Comics Symposium last spring. And when we did 6 months ago, we held several talks, which we all put up onto YouTube. So if you go to the University of Toronto at Scarborough, which is right here, the English department, UTSC, you can actually catch all of our presentations. We had amazing talks with David Robertson, with Catarieka Wenzi Dam, who's in a part of this place. But probably our most exciting panel was this one right here, which is that we got all of, no, not all of them, but most of the creators of the Marvel Comics edition of where Indigenous creators remade historically racist representations and superheroes, Indigenous superheroes, like John Proudstar, for example, or Danielle Moonstar. Basically these very problematic characters that Marvel has created throughout time and invited Indigenous creators to recreate those. And so you can get a chance to see what they talked about and what they spoke about in recreating these quite problematic characters, but from Indigenous perspectives. And again, based in reality, but fictional retellings. And so I think that's where Indigenous graphic novel is heading in the future. But it's really a corrective, right? Sort of correcting misperception, a miseducation about the past. But now in the future, like Chelsea Vowell does, to reimagine a future in which Indigenous sovereignty is fully actualized, is on our own terms, is negotiating with Canadian representation of what does Indigenous presence look like into the future. So that's just a very quick kind of thing of what I'm doing in the field of comics. So miigwech, everybody.
Oh, well, thank you very much. There's an awful lot there. And that's based on, yes, my question about the Canadian comics field. That's a lot going on there. And yeah, everyone should check out, there's links in the chat there for a lot of the information there. But I want to turn to Quebec. That was my initial idea here. And how about Frédéric? I know you've been going at this a long time, out of Montreal to Quebec. In fact, we started about the same time in the same neighborhood, as did Drawn and Quarterly, I guess. And I know you have a lot of connections to France. And correct me if I'm wrong, but part of when you started, what was going on in France was L'Association was coming up. And from what I understand, they were an influence for you with La Pastèque. And And again, my question here about being part of the Canadian comics field, do you feel like you're more a part of France, Quebec, or are you part of the whole Canadian contingent, would you say?
This evolved over time. When we started, you're right. We were influenced by what's happening at the time with L'Association, Cornelius, and the new, graphic novel movement, but also what was happening with, in Montreal as well. So our Canadian connection was very strong at the time. We were all part of the same events, going to SPX, TCAF, years and years ago, and just started. And actually, our first book was bilingual. It was either, it was in French and in English because we wanted to reach the Canadian market and in the US market as well.
Was that Sputnik?
Yeah, it was Pastèque.
Sputnik, yeah.
So, but then we moved, when we started La Pastèque, we wanted to relaunch Quebec comics because it wasn't more in a sleepy mode for, the few years because they had great times, but it was more a down period. So then we worked mainly on focus. Our focus was growing back the Quebec market, and then we we evolved to the French market, which is now, let's say, 40% of our revenues.
Okay.
But now I would say that the element I would like to talk about the Canadian feeling we have now is that we have been selling our books in Quebec, France, Belgium, Switzerland, and it is very frustrating. And it's actually a main objective of ours is to be able to sell our French Quebec comics to the rest of the Canada, having these books to reach, the East Coast or even the rest of the country, because I visited a few years ago, Type Books in Toronto, and they were ordering our books from France, not from our Canadian distributor, which is a complete nonsense. So there's a lot of structural elements to work on to create this great Canadian feeling of our either in English or French books being available in both markets, because this makes no sense for us that, let's say, a Vancouver comic books would like to order a few of our French books. Well, they will have to come order them from France in some ways. But we've been, trying to be part of the Canadian industry for the longest time. We've been, translating books from Drawn and Quarterly, from other publishers and authors in Canada. And so I think it's an important, and it's also very inspiring to see what's happening in that market, especially in the English side, because we've been trying to promote to the GG Awards for the longest time to create a graphic novel award. And now the irony is that Joe Ullman is the first comics artist to be nominated in the fiction section. We had a lot of nomination in the children illustrated books in the French, but now in the fiction, it remains to be seen in French. But we've been, discussing with the GG people there that the industry is strong enough and there's enough quality and quantity of production that, it's a mature art form now that we can, in a market as well, so we can expect that the GG award for graphic novels could see the light in the near future. So great. I will pass my voice to Luc.
Yes, Luc. I'm also going to point out before Frédéric goes La Pastèque that Conundrum Press has published some La Pastèque books, the French editions, into English. Michel Verbagliati, Riel Gabou. So there is access to those artists in English as well. Artists in Quebec. Luc, what do you have to say? Do you feel you're part of the Canadian? You sell in France as well, but you also, I will point out to everybody, you're a visionary, in my opinion, because you are the only one who's publishing editions in both French and English at the same time, or within months of each other anyway. And so you have a toe in both markets, and we'd be, it would be fascinating to know what your take on all this is.
It's funny because at the time I was planning as we wanted to start translating some of our books and having an English branch. Frédéric wrote to me, or you called me, I don't remember. He tried to tell me it's not a good idea to go English. And 5 years later, he was right.
Okay.
But not because I really like the idea of having a bilingual structure, because Montreal is bilingual. You have exposing in Montreal, you have almost 50 English exhibitors and French exhibitors, and even the visitors are a mix of English and French. Why I'm saying that Fred was right is because it's too much work. It's like having two publishing house, but still it's done. What is done is done. So I'm not giving up now. So it's because as I did with the French side, I didn't know what I was doing when I jumped in. I just, okay, well, let's make some books, let's print some graphic novels, woohoo! And after a few months, you realize, okay, how am I going to make some money, and how is it gonna work? And you start to struggle, and one book, and so having the English. When the English branch started, I realized that the two markets are completely different. But the Quebec market and the rest of Canada market, there's big differences on how the work, the network is working or evolving, or I don't know what there's one rule that makes a big difference in Quebec to make, because I feel like in an ecosystem, a book of ecosystem, you have to have, of course, the publishers, the authors, you have the booksellers, you have the distributors, and everybody's involved. And what I feel is the weakness of the English market is the independent bookstores, because the booksellers are so important in the process of loving your book, selling your book, and it's getting people about it. But there's a law that make a big difference in Quebec, because Quebec, we're part of North America, which is English, and we're kind of, to make an analogy, a comic analogy, we are the Gaulois village trying to resist in this English world. And that law is when public libraries have to buy books, they have to go through an independent bookstore. So that helps a lot for the revenues of those independent bookstores. So that means every public libraries and school public libraries too have to buy from them. So to have this kind of law protects or helps to I'm kind of losing my thoughts in what you asked, because I'm not sure.
That's okay.
I'm not sure you wanted to go there, but
well, you'll have it. Yeah, I mean, you can. I'll probably come back to this because I do find it really interesting, because it is. And it might come down to distribution, right? Because like you have a distributor in French. And from what I understand, you've told me it's pretty seamless, but your distribution in English, and maybe that does have something to do with the bookstores, is not. It seems a lot more complicated and difficult. Plus, there's comic shops versus bookstores versus libraries and this sort of thing. But and also, I mean, you obviously are involved a lot in translation and that sort of thing too, I assume, which gets quite complicated and expensive.
Yes, of course. Translations can be expensive, but let's forget about numbers and the reason why I want to do that and why I like doing that is because, like Mr. Sinclair was saying, is we have there's a lot of differences and a lot of culture, and we don't know each other that much in this big, vast country. And to translate some of our Quebec authors, it's a way of starting a conversation, trying to to be part of that community. I was talking about TCAF earlier, and being in TCAF, it was fun, and I wanted to do more and be there and trying to have this conversation with everybody, all the others authors, and there's some English authors we've been translating lately from Conundrum, and for me, I like this romantic idea of hey, let's share our culture through that comic, that media, actually.
Yeah, TCAF brings everyone together. It's okay, but we'll come back to that. We'll come back to you, Luc, on all this. How about that? I want to ask Julia, you're in Montreal as well, and Drawn and Quarterly does a lot of translations, and I saw you wrote in the chat here, in terms of readership in Montreal, being very bilingual. And also I want to ask about your history of Drawn and Quarterly, because you were very early, you've been there a long time. I don't want to say how many years, you can if you want, but I know you've been there.
I said it at the beginning. I'm not covering anything. Yeah, no, I think I do think that as I was saying in the chat just now, like I think that there is this, that is one of the advantages of being in this place, is that we have access to the French. We get to see what's happening in French comics as well as what's happening in English comics. And we get, and you know, now that we have the bookstores, which have been open for quite a long time, we have the chance to order in things that look interesting to us. And just to speak more to what Megan was asking about in the chat, like as a publisher, we get to order a bunch of titles into our bookstores that look interesting, and then we can look at them and say, oh, this comic looks really cool, like we should follow this author and see what happens next, or we should broach this. We can pick them up. But yeah, I do think it's interesting to note that readers in Montreal tend to be bilingual and tend to be interested in reading a comic in its original language. But I think as a broader point, I feel like D&Q being based here has made us more open to the project of translating titles in general. You know, we've been publishing titles in translation since the early 90s. And I also wanted to speak a little bit about awards and advocacy for awards, because Fred brought it up. And of course, this week we had really exciting news, which was that Joe Ullman's Fictional Father and Paul at Home, translated by Helga Dasher and Rob Aspinall, were both finalists for the Governor General Literary Award, which is the first time a comic has been recognized in any of the adult categories. And that's a huge deal because, yeah, Fred from La Pastèque and our team has been advocating for many years for comics to be recognized. And we just have kept submitting our books for consideration for these awards. And I think I actually come at it with a slightly different perspective than Fred. Like, we're not necessarily asking the Governor General Award to consider comics as its own category. We think that part of advocating for comics as a literary medium is to say, like, these books are as worthy of consideration, these translations are as worthy of consideration as any book that doesn't have pictures in it. There's nothing lesser of an art form to a comic than to anything else. And I'm not saying that having a category, a graphic novel category, means that it's lesser or different in any way, but I'm just thrilled that these books have been recognized. And I think that the importance of books being recognized by these kinds of prestigious awards actually can't be understated. We saw with, not a Canadian title, but when Nick Dranasso's Sabrina was longlisted for the Booker Prize, we saw just this tremendous flood of attention from the kinds of outlets that don't pay attention to comics normally. And we saw a huge sales bump. And just in general, the fact that the GGs, which is one of the most prestigious literary awards in Canada, is willing to look at comics means that we're paving the way for a comic to win the GGs, you know, like then to get those spaces in those larger, and a larger sale of the bookstore market, a larger representation in university classes that aren't comic specific. Yeah, so the GGs have categories, they do have categories for poetry and drama. And I'm not opposed to a graphic novel category. I'm just saying it's kind of exciting to me that they didn't say like, we need to have a graphic novel category. They said, this is fiction, this is nonfiction, this is translation, this is, and also if they did make a graphic novel category, would they recognize the translations in the comics category, or would they recognize, you know, it's things like that. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea here is that it's all literature, right? And I would also point out, because you didn't mention it, Seth was nominated for the Giller, which was the first, which is a fiction category. So that's a big deal too. Yay, Drawn and Quarterly, yay, Seth. I also, the other thing you,
I just wanted to say that part of, you know, the project of being publishers is this extremely unglamorous advocacy work behind the scenes to say to the Giller Prize, you know, with the Gillers, I think Jeet here was on the committee for the Gillers a couple of years before Seth got nominated, and that he was one of the ones who pushed them to start considering comics. So I think that's like a factor, but yeah, part of the project of publishing and of keeping the pendulum moving forward on publishing and on, you know, making a future for comics is about getting like comics out of the little box that people put it in for a long time.
Well, I can say personally that, I mean, the wheels of progress with the government turn very, very slowly. I mean, back in the 70s when I was doing Orb magazine, we applied for a Ontario Arts Council grant and a Canada Council grant, and we got both. The next year we applied again. We never heard anything back from the Ontario Arts Council, but I did get in touch with the Canada Council and said we were applying again. And the guy on the other end of the phone said, you got a grant for a comic book. And I said, yeah, last year we got a grant. And there was a long pause on the phone, and he said, sorry, that must have been a mistake. Anyways, I mean, in the last decade or two, the Canada Council and I believe the Ontario Arts Council also have opened up for grants for graphic novels, for comics. I mean, Chester Brown got one for paying for it, for his memoir about dealing with women of the night, our tax dollars at work. And anyways, I'm really pleased that Joe Ullman got nominated.
Hamilton.
What's that?
From Hamilton.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
actually, James, while you're talking, I mean, you were involved with starting. Speaking of awards, you were involved in starting the Joe Shuster Awards. Yeah. Do you want to talk about why that happened and how that happened?
Well, I was involved with the Paradise Comics convention at the time. I was on their advisory committee, and one of the things I brought up at that time was, why don't we try to do a Canadian awards like the Eisner Awards in the States? I got a little bit of resistance at first, but then we went ahead and did it. And you know, I just think it's so important to recognize our own talents in this country. I mean, I just think it's such a boost for people to feel that what they're doing is important, what they're doing is significant. And as much as possible that we can do that, you know, I'm all for it. The Doug Wright Award started a little, I think it was a little bit after us. And, you know, they're doing the same. I'm not with the Joe Shuster Awards anymore. And I'm sad to say they're not really what they used to be. Not just saying because of my participation isn't there, but they haven't really evolved in the way I would have liked. But I just think it's important. I think any sort of award, it just boosts people's incentive to go forward. I mean, a lot of people, are down on, different award shows, the Oscars or whatever. But I think in a lot of ways, when somebody gets that, if it can just light a little more fire under their ass, why not?
Yeah, well, it helps, sell another book too, right? I mean, obviously they're gonna, as a creator, you work really hard and you get recognized, and therefore it makes it easier to create some more. And exactly. Now, I just want to go back. You mentioned we're gonna stick with the past here. So you talked about in the 70s, you worked on a magazine or a comic called Orb. Can you just explain where that came from and sort of the legacy of that particular publication?
Well, I was going to Sheridan College for a year, and it was actually the very first year of their comic book creator course. It lasted, I think, about 5 or 6 years. It was put together by an English teacher who worked at Sheridan College, Walter Hanson. And I stayed with it for the first year. It was in its real embryonic form, so it was a little bit disorganized. I got involved with the student magazine, and that sort of gave me a bit of the publishing bug at that time, working as like an art director on this magazine. And I met a lot of people at the college that were in my course. And basically after the year that I spent in that course, me and a number of my friends from the college pooled our money and decided, let's put out a comic. So we put out Orb magazine. The first one was funded by all of us. And basically it was, we wanted to show that it could be done. And we did it for 6 issues, and we were incredibly terrible businessmen, and we went out of business. But I look at it in a lot of ways as, and John Bell talked about this a bit yesterday, is that he said when he saw Captain Canuck, which came a year after Orb started up, and he saw Orb on the newsstands, it got him interested again in comics. And I sort of look at what we did with Orb is like a pebble thrown in a pond, and the ripples, the repercussions from it, because there's a lot of people, Ken Stacy, Ron Sutton, Peter Sue, Jim Craig, Don Marshall, Vince Marchesano, a lot of people that got their start with Orb. And, I don't want to pat myself on the back that much, but a lot of them, went on to careers in animation and other stuff in that, and working for American companies, doing a lot of other, comic book work. And, if we were able to give that little bit of a start to a lot of them, I'm just pleased that was what came out of it.
Great. Yeah. That's great. Yeah. I should also point out, I'm going to go back, since I'm just going to finish up with the past here. Julia, the founder of Drawn and Quarterly, Chris Oliveros, big shout out to Chris. He was instrumental in getting the graphic novel even recognized as a term with libraries and bookstores. I mean, we forget that bookstores and libraries didn't even have graphic novel sections even 10 years ago. And I thank Chris Oliveros for putting in that work. So I'm going to move along here to, I know we haven't heard from Sarah, for example, but one of the cultural fields in comics that's really growing, I think, is the YA, the young adult publishing field, if you want to call it that. A number of the panelists here would have some interesting things to say about that. Frédéric publishes kids books, perhaps YA books. I don't even know if there's a YA category in French, but Sarah Saller has just started a YA imprint. Why did you feel that was necessary, Sarah Saller?
Thanks, Andy. So I was, we had been talking about the possibility of doing something that focuses on YA books for a while, as you know, but everyone else here doesn't. So this had kind of been in the back of our mind for a while, and we were starting to get to the point where we could make it a reality. And it was around the same time that we had Canada Reads, or sorry, I Read Canadian. Has anybody encountered that in kind of the wider fiction world right now? Yeah. So it's kind of a movement in the children's literature world where people are focusing on publishing more Canadian creators. So around the time we were starting to talk about the EMANATA imprint, I was starting to think about the mandate and what I really wanted this to be, where it's something that we're only publishing one title a year right now. I really wanted to be very focused in terms of this, I guess, this niche that we're offering to people. I wanted to make sure that we could kind of get not the biggest bang for our buck, it's not about money, but like we could make the most of this one slot that we had per year. And when we were doing the I Read Canadian thing, so I write children's books as well, in addition to the, all these other things. And so I was grabbing books off the shelf to post on Instagram to support my fellow authors. And so I had on Instagram, I had like, here's a bunch of Canadian picture books, and here's a bunch of middle grade books by Canadian authors. And when I get to a section, we have lots of graphic novels around the house. I read them, my kids read them, everybody in the house. So we have a pile. And I started gathering them all up. And then the ones that I had thought actually were Canadian. And when I started flipping them over before I took pictures of them, because I wanted to make sure, I realized so many of them were by Americans. And often they were published by Canadian publishers as well, which is kind of why I had made the assumption, oh, this one must be Canadian. And I'd flip it over and be like, oh. So as I started going through that process, and also alongside of that, thinking about my goals for EMANATA, that's why I decided that I wanted to focus solely on people living in Canada currently, so that I could make that one spot that's available currently to Canadian authors. So that's why I made that choice. In terms of YA, I think there's just, partly because there is that small contingent of Canadian people being published in the YA graphic novel market, because it's so niche. I think that there's lots of opportunity there, because I think there's a lot of people working in that area. There's a lot of people working in picture books. So the talent is there. There's already people creating graphic narratives. And so I want to take all those people who are doing these work in other areas that have the skills to do YA and pull them into this space.
Sarah, I was just curious about the name EMANATA.
Yeah. So EMANATA is
Anagram? Is it an anagram? Or?
It's not. So and this is funny because as we were trying to come up with a name, I was actually texting Andy a whole bunch of ideas off the top of my head. And one of the things—
Never a good idea. Yeah.
No, I do this to him all the time. Anyways, I was actually Googling comic terms, just like various comic terms, and EMANATA was what I came across. And what it is in a comic panel, how you see like, if something's hot, little squiggly lines, or if somebody's surprised, they might have the little like, lines shooting out of their heads, or if they're scared, they might have sweat, like little sweat drops. Those are EMANATA.
Never knew that.
I know, nobody does.
There's a book by Mort Walker, creator of Beetle Bailey, that is all about this. So it's become the language of comics, but he actually gives it all a name.
Wow.
He defines all this.
Yeah. So I went with that because, young adult, when we're teens, everything's feelings, right? So it pulled together what I was, the YA piece, and it also pulled together the comics piece. So it's all good.
Gotta make sure if Mort Walker trademarked that.
Yeah.
Sarah, so we're casually tossing around this term YA. Is there a definition? Is there an age range?
Yeah, so young adult is typically, well, actually it's funny because depending on who you ask, it's either 12 and up or 13 and up. I tend to operate with 12 and up, but I'm pretty loose. Basically it's the teenage years, and it focuses on kind of the standard is that the protagonist should fall within that age group. It should be typically a coming of age story. And then of course, deal with the types of themes that and be written for those age groups as well. But I would say the biggest things that are kind of the common ground in young adult is that 12 and up protagonist, and then coming of age themes. There's a new actual kind of like subcategory that's just emerging now called new adult, which is that in between area between like 18 and I'm not sure the parameters, but like 18 and 22 now. So it's amazing how everything evolves over time. But yeah, as far as the way I'm operating the imprint, I'm looking for protagonists between 12 and 18.
Okay, great. I wanted to ask Frédéric, you pointed out the Governor General's Award, that you had a winner in the Governor General's Award in French, Jane Renard, yes?
Yeah, Jane the Fox and me and Harvey.
Right.
And at the time when we published these books, there was nothing called the YA.
I was going to ask about that. So in French, is that a thing? Like, is there a publishing category?
It is not yet. It's
No,
starting to appear because a lot of French publishers has been translating and buying rights for these YA comics from the US or Canadian market. But it's not as precise and growing market per se in France. But we've been doing at La Pastèque a few of these books. I would say some of Luc feel and fall into that category as well. I mean, we're aiming at younger readers in the graphic novel style, but it's like Harvey the book, it's a cross between a picture book and a graphic novel. It's nothing specific to either of or both, but it's a book that was a big a launch pad for us when we open up for the more younger readers in our production.
Okay.
Letting loose of the traditional approach for how we define a picture book or a graphic novel. And so we let a lot of creative liberty to the creators, no limitation in a number of pages or formats or anything like this, just push forward the narrative and the storytelling as much as they can. So in that way, we created this little specific or unique books. And like we just been nominated this week as well for a GG. We have three nominations, but one would be considered a YA graphic novel. It's Boué by Catherine Lepage. And it's really the teen years, and with our amazing graphic style of our own. And this book is doing great. It's been receiving a lot of great reviews in France as well. So I think the YA section in the more US or Canadian market is very, very market driven. I mean, this is very specific in what you see. Most of the books look all the same when I look at them, like the design and the formats and stuff. So we don't approach it that way. I mean, it's a vision of the creator that must come forward, and then we'll package it and sell it at some point, but and aim it at the right readers. But after this long answer, there's no YA specific market in French or France, even in Quebec, but a lot of publishers are doing these books anyways, less in a package or format than what the US and Canadian market has become. Yeah.
Do you think that is a I mean, it sounds like that's a potential market, like that you could completely like, hey, we're already doing these books, we're going to call them something different. And you could really start the trend. Is that possible? Or in France, I mean, they're pretty set in their ways, I imagine.
No, France is very this might sound very weird what I'm going to say, but it's very square. I mean, what's happening in bookstores in France is very, very traditional. So everything is if you have a book that can be offered in two different sections, then the bookstores won't carry the book at all. I mean, it has to be very, very traditional and specific. So, yeah.
Frédéric, your company got a Joe Shuster Award years ago as
Yes.
best publisher, best comic publisher
Yay.
in Canada. So I hope that was helpful. That was actually a year after I left the awards, but I was certainly pleased to see that happen.
But it was a great recognition for sure. Thank you.
Sure.
Before we kick off the YA, we're going to get to some questions. Everyone watching, if you have a question, now is the time to write it in the chat. And we're going to get to that because we have about 20 minutes and we'll get to some questions. But I just wanted to ask Luc, being in the both the English and the French markets there, some of the books that you do could be considered YA, but I don't think you call them that. But when you sell them in English, do you start calling them YA? Have you got to that point, or?
I think that's one of the biggest difference that struck me when I started to do the books is everything has to be labeled, and there's so much data going attached with publishing compared to the Quebec market.
Yes.
That's the thing that discouraged me a bit, because when I'm doing a book, do I like that book? I'm not thinking about who's going to read it. Of course, we're doing books for adults, but there's a lot of books that I see in younger kids, and I was surprised. I'm not thinking about someone when we're publishing a book. Of course, there you have a wide kind of a target you have in mind, but not that specific. And I don't really like that approach of doing books, because I've talked with some authors, English authors, that even before starting their book, they're thinking about their market and their target.
Yeah, sure.
It's super counterproductive, and you're kind of putting limits to yourself. You should do the book you want to do, and it will find your public, your readers. So yeah.
What you say about data is so true. I recently, or last few years, have expanded in the US and got a US distributor. Julia obviously knows all about this. And I went from making books to producing data. Like as a publisher, like that was my role. As a publisher, that's what I spent my day doing. What used to be, I would make a book, like edit, design, get it printed, and then it became managing data. And that's kind of what the publishing world has turned to. So, then you need to compromise where your time goes and adjust. But so I sympathize with the English world and our data, and I wish we could be selling to the French. But I'm going to start getting to some questions here. Candida, you had a question. I understand. Oh, there you are. Hello.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. It's super interesting as an academic to hear how the sausages get made and all of the issues that you face. I posted my question after Niigaan had talked, and I'll start by posing it to him, but it's really for all of you, and it's about the mainstreaming of comics. So I was wondering how Niigaan feels about mainstream publishing rushing to get Indigenous titles, right? And that includes comics versus small presses like Highwater publishing these stories. And really, it's a question for all of you. Is it good for the field, or is it a problem for you as owners of small presses that large multinational publishing houses, who shall remain nameless, are moving into the kind of indie comics scene? But I want to ask specifically about Niigaan, about sort of Indigenous editing and publishing, and whether or not it's a good thing that some of these mainstream houses are kind of, to put it bluntly, jumping on the reconciliation wagon and trying to get Indigenous titles into their catalogs. So yeah, I'll ask Niigaan to start, and maybe other people can jump in.
Well, my position is that anybody who wants to publish Indigenous writers is a good thing. So that's my opening position. But what I would say is that, you're never going to get conversations around sovereignty from Marvel or DC. You're just never going to get substantial, decent quality talking about Indigenous pedagogy from the exact institutions that have profited off the marginalization and exploitation of Indigenous communities. And I'm including the government in that regard. I'm including corporate development, like what I always say is, you know, we're so invested in bringing business to Winnipeg as an example. But the fact is that the only people that will invest in Winnipeg are the people from Winnipeg, and who are the people who have been here the longest are Indigenous peoples. And so when we invest in urban reserves or Indigenous businesses, 100% of the money stays here. The stories are here. They are centered in the continuation of this place. They are in the pedagogy of this place. IKEA, Walmart, insert any other corporate development, Marvel, DC, they're invested in supporting the work of elsewhere, in fact, of nowhere often, because they're not actually located in a place. So they're invested most oftentimes in just the 1% and in ensuring that that 1% stays 1%. So, you know, understanding it for what it is. And I think, you know, the fact is that mainstream comic books have profited mightily, and many independent publishers, off horrendous stereotypes and racist depictions of Indigenous peoples in our issues. And much in the way that all of Canadian society has, which is that all of Canadian society is built off the theft of Indigenous lands, misrepresenting Indigenous peoples as savages and foils and villains. And then has, and I talk about this a lot in my classes, have legitimized the exact colonization projects that have been pursued by governments and policies. So like, for example, there's a really good comic book, you know, just as Indigenous activism is coming up in the 1970s, people are occupying Wounded Knee, Alcatraz, people are occupying Anishinaabe Park in Kenora. You know, suddenly then Superman gets captured by Indians and they hold him for ransom. You know, like, so it's exactly, you know, that's the kind of comics that you're going to expect from big mainstream corporate publishers, and frankly, some independent publishers, because independent publishers can produce as bad stuff as anybody else. And so what I would say is that what's exciting to me is that many Indigenous publishers or young independent publishers are working with Indigenous peoples more, because they have a sense of responsibility to the community in which they live, so that you simply just can't get away with misrepresenting, or, you know, the fact is that it's actually marketable. And that's the interesting thing about Highwater, is that they found a market there wasn't a market before. There was no market for Indigenous stories from Manitoba. And now Highwater has found that place. And now what's happened is Penguin has discovered, oh, we can make money off this too. And they are producing better quality work because of the independent publishers. And there is no way in hell it would have happened the other way around. Like, there's no way in hell that Penguin would have produced anything of any merit, and therefore independent publishing would have produced things better. It's because of the bravery and the courage of independent publishers that therefore you get decent work with Penguin. But again, with Penguin, you'll get very vanilla-like work, because they've got a number of issues that they've got to control. And the number one issue is they're worried about their own culpability, or their own responsibility in relation to words like unseated, and that's how I talked about today, you know. And they're much more interested in those exact forces that lead to the exploitation in the first place. So what I would say is that it's concerning but it's also, if you expect anything more than you know, burgers that are worth 10% of meat from McDonald's, then you're just simply not shopping at the right place. You're not thinking about where you're eating. And the fact is that occasionally McDonald's can produce something that's tasty and something that has a little bit of nutritional value, but you're never going to get a decent meal from McDonald's. And I think the same thing could be said with the DC and Marvel for anything Indigenous. You're going to get that 10%, that kind of slight tastiness, but you'll never get the decent quality that people who have actual relationships with Indigenous peoples are creating. And that was a pretty damn good metaphor, if you ask me.
I love that metaphor. I'm curious to see how Zach's going to tweet that out within the limits of Twitter to explain that. Thanks so much.
I fail miserably.
Does anyone else want to sort of talk about the relationship now in comics publishing between your small presses and the majors?
Sarah has her hand up.
Hi. Yeah, no, I'd like to address that a little bit as well, and kind of echo some of what Niigaan said, in that we operate in our own space. And yes, we have a relationship with these big presses, and that we all exist in the same industry. But I think the fact that and I'm totally going rogue here because I'm not sure what Andy thinks about this, but I think that there's a benefit to having these publishers move into this space, because I think, as we were talking before about awards and things like that, anything that legitimizes graphic novels in the mainstream space is going to ultimately help us. Although it does create additional competition, of course. I think that the key for us as independent publishers is to just keep doing what we do well. Like I was talking in the chat earlier with Frédéric about he was saying that a lot of the YA books are very market driven and look the same. And I think one of the things that we at Conundrum and EMANATA do really well is let our artists' vision shine through, and we let them really do what they do best, use their own style. And I think that those are the things that we can bring to the table. And I think as long as we stay true to those things, then we'll be okay.
There you go. Julia.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where us being a publisher that publishes primarily in the United States comes in, because we're seeing the push from the increasing corporatization and like the fact that all of the big publishers are basically eating each other is a huge impact on us, because we see more competition for our authors. We see that we're having to, as comics develops, I'm trying to put this in a way that recognizes that it's an honor and a privilege to be able to continue to publish these authors. And to be able to compete with mega publishers like Penguin Random House. But yeah, we're definitely seeing that this renewed recognition from big corporate publishers like Penguin Random House, like HarperCollins, like Simon & Schuster, that all of these publishers are interested in developing comics imprints, and more so they're interested in kids comics because of the success of Dogman and of Raina Telgemeier's comics. But they are interested in adult comics as well. And that is something that I think we've seen a few waves of that in comics publishing. Like there was a big wave of that after, not Rusty Brown, after Jimmy Corrigan came out, Jimmy Corrigan and Linda Berry's 100 Demons, when that cycle of comics first emerged, there was a big push from the corporate publishers to acquire comics. And I think we're back in another cycle of that to some degree. And it is an ongoing concern for us, but also we know that we are the ones who will put our authors first. We know how to edit comics. We know how to market comics. We know how to find the readers for the comics. So while the big corporate publishers can offer, $200,000 advances for our authors, they're not going to sell the foreign rights to those titles in the way that we would. They're not going to sell through the units in the way that we would. They're not going to follow the book, and they're not going to follow the author, whereas many of our authors have been with us for 10, 20, 30 years, because we are invested in their careers and not just in the one-time glamour of being able to publish them. And of course, for us, I think I say this often when I'm talking about our books, but I think one of the things that makes my job so enjoyable and so easy as the marketing director at Drawn and Quarterly is that so much of what we do is actually bringing an author's vision into the world as, as close to and as completely and wholly as we can. We are trying to take a project and to show it into the world, bring it into the world, bring it to readers, bring it to librarians, bring it to academics, bring it to all different people, and to show it for everything that it does and everything that it can do for a book. Trailed off there. Anyway, that was my...
That sounds great. Yeah. And Drawn and Quarterly, I would say, is a huge success story, a huge Canadian success story in the comics field for sure. And again, that by embracing literature, by embracing the literary comics and bringing graphic novels into the discussion of literature. And I think that's extremely important. So we have, 8 minutes. So Candida, there's a lot of discussion going on in the chat. Much of it is actually being answered. Lots of questions are actually being answered by the panelists as they go. They're far better at it than me, I gotta say. There's stuff there about manga, Canadian manga, which I didn't even know was a thing, Canma. And actually asking about how translations happen. So there's all sorts of things. Candida, is there a specific question that we should attend to?
I think Zach has got his eyes on that, so I'm going to throw that to him.
Zach, do you have your eyes on that?
We actually have a follow-up question for the last conversation from Ivan. Ivan says, Niigaan mentioned the tension between top-tier publishers and independent publishers. Where do things like self-published and crowd-funded enterprises fit into the larger picture?
Okay. Is there anyone who wants to tackle that? Self-published and crowd-funded public.
The one successful example, I think, with crowd-funded pieces are the Moonshot collection, which is an Indigenous grassroots collection that was created basically from crowdfunders. They've done 3 anthology issues now. I think, like most things, when you get into a lot of cooks in the kitchen, there can be a lot of a conflict. And so the thing with that project that's happened is because there's no central publisher, you get a lot of bickering and a lot of political fighting between the creators within that work. But I mean, other than that, it's been a pretty successful edition, produced some very high quality work in those, mostly because it's creator created. And so other than the politics and the fact that, I don't want to get into the drama that was created, but one of the editors that was involved with that was had to leave in very disgraceful conditions, and we could probably all figure out who that is in the Canadian comics world. And so she was involved with that, and that was a very ugly situation. And so she's no longer involved. So I think that a lot of the momentum has left that particular project, but I think there is an evidence of some excellent crowd starting with that Moonshot edition. So anyways, that's what I would just say. There isn't a lot of precedence within Indigenous comics for that, because I think it's such a small kind of corner of the market, but I think there's one good example there.
Yeah, I might just mention, so self-publishing and crowdfunding, it is a huge thing that a lot of, you go to TCAF, you'll see many people with their self-published comics, many of which have been funded through crowdsourcing. And that's great. That's a publishing model that actually works. I mean, the crowdfunding is essentially what someone like Dickens would have done back in his day. It's basically, you're just serializing something and you're getting it paid for in advance. It's a subscription service. So it's an interesting publishing model. Part of the problem with that is distribution. Again, if you want to actually sell what you're making, how do you do that? And the problem is, it used to be far more places, like you could just walk into a magazine store or a bookstore and hey, sell my zine or sell my chapbook or my mini comic and on consignment. And it's like, here's $5, give me 2 or whatever. Those places don't really exist very much anymore. It used to be many, like I'm talking the 90s here, in the 2000s, and obviously back to the 70s, fanzines and all that stuff. But now, it's like Diamond especially monopolizing distribution, and they won't even take floppies unless they sell a certain amount. And so it's become very difficult. But on the crowdfunding, Luc, you funded your entire translation program, didn't you, through crowdfunding at the very beginning? What was your experience with that?
I did 2 crowdfunding. It was fun. Crowdfunding is fun because there's a rush of raising money, but it's too much work in the end. if I were to do it again, I will simplify the offer and not try to do into all those goodies and stuff like that. But what I found with the crowdfunding platform is I realized that there's a reason why there's a distributor, there's a bookseller, why there's a publisher, why there's, because
exactly,
yeah, because it's okay. You founded your book, but afterwards you have to ship it, deal with the shipment not delivered and stuff like that. Micromanaging, and it's another old system, and it's good for getting out there, getting known. But when I see independent authors or stuff like that doing it, sometimes the work of a publisher is important. So if you're not working with one, you're more so doing to have this system or this process of having publishers involved, editors and stuff like that. It's an important process,
sure.
And it's something. It stays on the amateur level when speaking of crowdfunding. I'm not against it. I'm not far from it. I'm still backing some projects from time to time, and I like this old independent stuff. But I think it has a limit at one point. And
you make a good point. It's a lot of work just to run the funding platform. I have an artist who offers. When you do it, you say, okay, if you support me, I'll give you your extras, right? And she said the amount of money she brought in didn't even pay for her time to make the extras. So in fact, she was losing money. So it's work, right? So so we have like 1 or 2 minutes left. I'm assuming that we're going to get cut off or something. So the way to end this perhaps is just to talk about what's, for all of you, in 2 minutes, or 1 minute or less, what a future project that you're working on. And I'm just going to go in the order that I see you. So Julia, anything exciting in 30 seconds or less?
Just so you know, you're not going to get cut off.
Not going to get cut off. Okay, you got a minute then, or 2 minutes.
Okay. I think that probably the book that everyone here is the most excited about that we have coming is Kate Beaton's Ducks, 2 Years in the Oil Sands. Which is just, it's 500 pages long, and I sent it to somebody to read, and I said, I'm not going to say happy reading because it's not happy reading. It is an emotional gut punch. It is such a powerful comic. It is, it tells so many, it talks so intimately and about so many important conversations. About it's her memoir of her experiences living in the oil sands, working in the oil sands for 2 years, and being the lone woman in a crowd full of men, and all of the different ways that class and gender and the environment and all of these other things swirl together in that space and in her experiences. Yeah, that's coming out next fall. And that's
Great.
Probably our biggest, like our most significant Canadian title this coming year.
That's awesome. Yes. And Kate Beaton lives in Mabou, right? Nova Scotia, representing. James, you're next in my list of heads. What do you have coming up?
Well, as I mentioned before, I'm working actually on a prose book, a biography of Captain George Henderson. And it's subtitled The Two Sides of Canada's Original Comic Book Guy. And when I say two sides, I'll leave it at that. But George was a big influence in early days. He was a writer, actually did a number of scripts for Orb magazine when I published that. He was like a mentor at the time. When I first moved to Toronto to go to the art college, George was like the only game in town. So the book I'm working on, it's with Rob Lamberti. He's my co-writer on it. Rob Lamberti's a big comic fan, comic dealer. He also wrote for the Toronto Sun. He was a crime reporter for the Toronto Sun. So he's my co-writer on that. Other than that, it's the relaunch of the character that I wrote back in the day with Orb Magazine, The Northern Light, which we'll probably be doing a Kickstarter campaign for, and we may be dealing with an East Coast publisher with that, Andy. It won't be Conundrum, unfortunately.
Okay.
But
okay.
It is
I look forward to seeing it.
possibly another company out there, but
Okay, great.
I'm working with an artist that I just discovered in the last couple months who is just.
Do you want to name names?
Well, I don't want them to be stolen by anybody else, so I'll keep it to myself.
A lot of publishers here. Yes. Okay.
But
Okay.
he's amazing, and I'm sure we're going to do it in miniseries. So we'll probably do a 6-issue miniseries to begin with the Northern Lights, similar in a way like Mike Mignola has done the Hellboy series over the years. It's been little miniseries with breaks in between. It's sort of the same sort of thing like streaming TV has gone to, where there's possibly big gaps between series and that. But the artist that I'm working with, like I said, he's so amazing, and we'll probably do 6 issues, and then Marvel or somebody will grab him up, and I'll be doing it.
Well, we'll look for that. We'll look for the Kickstarter. That's great. Thank you. Niigaan, do you have something that you're working on that you'd like to let people know about?
Nothing actively at the moment because of all my obligations. And then, of course, I'm a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. So my whole life is basically issues. And this federal election campaign, endless amounts of writing that I did for that. I wrote for Maclean's and for CBC and for the Winnipeg Free Press. And anyways, and so I'm just kind of recovering from that. But there is a really exciting project that I'm on a grant for, which I'm only a co-collaborator for, but I think it's an exciting. So it's a comic book on residential schools affiliated with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and it's headed up by Sean Carlton, who is a non-Indigenous colleague of mine, but works in my department of Native Studies, and so he's doing some great stuff. We're trying to tell. So one of my jobs, I think, is to sort of nuance the story of residential schools and talk about the ways that people found humor within that experience, within a very horrendously violent genocidal experience, but that people still found ways to build relationships in that experience. So I always find that to be one of the most interesting parts of what I bring to the table, which is I know all these stories about my auntie and my grandma and my granny and all this kind of other stories that are talking about what they did to subvert the nuns, have a couple laughs during recess, and try to figure out a way to try to escape all the violence that's happening around them. So there's some pretty interesting stories, I think, that'll come into that book. So
is there a title of the project?
Oh no, we haven't even started the process of that book, but we got the grant about 2 months ago. So we got the grant to hire illustrators and to start to write the book. So we'll do that probably in the new year. So
that sounds awesome. Frédéric, what have you got going on at La Pastèque?
Yeah, we'll be launching early next year. First monography for Michel Rabaghetti's career. It's going to be a 300 pages book, deluxe book. It's a large, very long form interview with his views and focus on his career and his work. And also there's a bit of a educative project on how to approach, comics work or to creation, and a lot of, never before seen visuals and sketches and stuff. And also the big book coming early next year as well is the new book by Cyrus, along with Marc Tessier on the life of the painter Jean Dallaire. It's going to appear on a coming soon section of our website. It's going to be an amazing book. It's been 6-7 years they've been working on it. So great book to start the year. So that's the two main projects I can talk about right now.
Okay, great. I should also point out, anyone in Montreal, La Pastèque actually has a storefront in the same way that Drawn and Quarterly has a storefront. And they're probably about, 3 blocks away from each other. So if you wanted to check out, La Pastèque sells only La Pastèque books, I think, but it's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool boutique. And yes, Michel Rabaghetti is a Canadian institution, and Cyrus should be too, but he's we'll get there with serious. Luc, what do you got working on? What are you working on?
Right now, I'm struggling to put out books because of the paper crisis we're facing right now. And we're about to print our biggest book, over 500 pages, color pages. So finding paper for that book was a challenge. And some of our fall books have been pushed till January because of that situation. And I don't know, there's no specific title that comes to mind. And the next one is going to be Xian, one of the big powerhouse in Quebec. I find it one of the huge hot author. And afterwards, it's going to be Catherine Oslo with her new book called Symptôme. And we have many, many more books coming next year. And yeah.
Yeah, Luc brings up a point which we didn't even address in this panel, is right now it's unprecedented times in the publishing industry with lack of paper, shipping holdups. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But again, that's another panel. There's plenty of articles out there. New York Times just had a big article all about this. So that's for a different time. But Sarah Saller, it sounds like you get the last word. What are you working on? I know what you're working on. Why don't you let us know?
I'm so excited about this. So currently I'm working with a local to me artist in Nova Scotia, Lynette Richards, on our first EMANATA title. So it's going to be out in fall 2022, and it's called Call Me Bill. And what it is for those of you who don't know, before the Titanic, the SS Atlantic was actually the biggest maritime disaster. And that was in 1873. And of course, there was a huge loss of life, unfortunately, but in a big rescue effort by the local Nova Scotians and people living in Nova Scotia. And when they were going through, unfortunately, to see who they could recover, there was one sailor, and they assumed the sailor was a man until the wind blew up the person's blouse and they saw breasts. And this was written about in the newspaper at the time. And this artist, who also works on the SS Atlantic Heritage Board, I can't remember the exact name, came across this little note in the newspaper in her own research and decided to dig into this sailor's story. And she actually managed to, through a series of writings that she managed to track down, she actually figured out, she was able to unpack this person's entire story of what their home life was like and how they came to be on this ship. It's been a really interesting process for me because I'm non-binary. So it's been interesting to go through the process of the story with the artist, who is a lesbian. And we have these two, when we process it through our own lenses, we have kind of two different viewpoints, which actually makes it super interesting and has lent to an approach where we've been able to kind of leave it open so that anybody who reads it can have their own interpretation and see it through their own lens. So it's been an interesting and exciting project on its own because I love history, but also because it's exploring gender in such an interesting way. So very exciting to launch that.
There you go. Last word to Sarah Saller. So we look forward to seeing all these projects in fruition. Zachary, are we done here? I mean, I think we've gone over a few 10 minutes. Okay. Should we wrap things up? I think
that sounds great. Yeah, that sounds great. I will post, Canada beat me to it by a second. The link for the next panel.
There you go. Okay. I would like to thank all our panelists. Absolutely. The amount of knowledge and the breadth of publishing experience, comics or otherwise, on this panel is really inspiring. And I've learned a lot today, and I look forward to having more discussions like this with all of you. And yeah, see you all at TCAF, I guess, maybe.
Well, thank you for this, Andy. Thank you for being the moderator, and nice meeting.
My pleasure.
I mean, watch everybody. Thanks so much.
Merci.
Thanks,
Thank
Andy.
you. Bye.